If you're ready, we'll hit the record button and we'll get this started. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar number 4 in the Connecticut Hemp webinar series. As we give folks just a few more minutes to join with us, we're going to do just a little bit of housekeeping and some information for you. One note of point that this meeting has been approved with the Connecticut DEEP for pesticide recertification credits. Suresh Gamiri from Yukon Extension will explain that just a little bit more towards the end of this program. As we get ready for this, this is webinar number 4 in a 6-part series. This one is going to talk about hemp disease identification and management. This is part of a 6-part series where we've talked about Connecticut state regulations, seed and hybrid selection, propagation and clones, transplanting and soil health and soil management practices. And all of these have been recorded, so please feel free to visit the Connecticut RC&D website for links to all of these webinars and for information about upcoming webinars. Our next webinar is going to be Wednesday, April 21st, 11:45 a.m., talking about processing and lessons learned, looking towards the future. The last webinar of this series is going to be May 5th with Scott Lewins from UVM, where he's going to be talking about hemp, insects, and weeds, and current management techniques and tools available. If you haven't already, please register for the upcoming webinars in this series at the Connecticut RC&D, the Connecticut RC&D website under hemp. Some notes as we get started, that this webinar is being recorded and all participants are going to be muted and cameras off so that we can focus on the speakers. There are 2 different options for communication this morning. We'll have the question and answer box open, as well as the chat box. We'd encourage you to use the questions and answers for all questions to the speakers. So if you do have a question that you'd like to ask the speaker as we're getting more information this morning, please feel free to type any and all questions into that question and answer box. And the chat box is available for everyone to use if you'd like to share any thoughts related to these topics with the community. You can use the chat box to type in any of your experience or things you'd like to share with the community. This webinar series was made possible with the planning partners, including the Connecticut Department of Agriculture, the Connecticut Hemp Industry Association, Yukon Extension, USDA NRCS, and the Connecticut RC&D. As we get started, I'll introduce myself. My name is Jim Hyde. I'm an agronomist with the Connecticut USDA NRCS. I work largely with soil nutrient management and animal agriculture, soil health, cover cropping, always looking for ways to improve or maintain our soils for the long-term growth and productivity of agriculture. I've got 2 people I'd like to introduce to you today. We've got Alyssa Collins from Penn State, and we've got Suresh Gamiri from Yukon Extension. I'm going to introduce Dr. Collins first, but we'll close with Yukon's own Suresh to describe the hemp team and resources available for local growers. Right now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Alyssa Collins from Penn State, who will be presenting hemp disease identification and management. Dr. Collins is director of the Penn State Southeast Agricultural Research and Extension Center in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Alyssa is a member of the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture Industrial Hemp Steering Committee. She also serves on the editorial board for Hemp Grower Magazine and leads the Penn State Extension Hemp Education and Outreach team. Along with her colleagues, she's been participating in hemp production research in Pennsylvania since 2017. Her research focus is on fiber and grain production, as well as disease management across different growing systems. So with that, I will hand it over to Alyssa Collins.
Great, thank you so much for having me. We were chatting a little bit earlier about how hemp happens to you. You don't go out and seek hemp, it kind of comes to you as a specialty. And I think that's the case with most of us across the country, right? So that said, my traditional background is plant pathology, so vegetable and agronomic systems. But through a series of retirements, became the hemp specialist at Penn State too. So this kind of combines both those loves for me. And it's going to be a whole lot of information that we don't know yet, but based on other systems, we can kind of figure out and give you a good idea about how we're going to go about managing disease in this new old crop, right? So as we go along, feel free to ask questions where you think they should be answered, and I will do my best and we'll point out a bunch of resources for you. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now and get this set up. And usually we have to switch this around, and hopefully that looks okay to you. So those of you who have been growing hemp for a while probably noticed that all the romanticized notions about this crop, not all of them were entirely accurate, right? So some of the mythology around hemp is that it's the easiest thing in the world to grow and you just throw it out there, it takes care of itself, and you know, it doesn't need any fertilizer or pesticides or anything like that, and it's going to save the world. Well, you know, usually things have a root in truth, but it's not all entirely true, especially if we're trying to grow a crop, right? Plants all came out of the wilderness, and when we decided we wanted to use them for something, we brought them into an agricultural system, and then we started to farm them, and hemp is no different, right? If we want to get a crop out of it, we have to actually farm it. And so, you know, some of these things that we have heard turned out not to be so true once we started growing for a couple of years. And our focus today is on the disease part of that system. So what I'd like to kind of cover here is understanding integrated disease management. So, you know, looking at what all the components of that are focused on hemp. I'd also like to introduce you to some of the more common pathogens and diseases that are starting to pop up in the Northeast. And Connecticut's a little bit different than Pennsylvania, so you may be seeing different things than we are and vice versa. But in general, here are the things we're seeing in the Northeast. And then I'm going to point out a bunch of resources as we go through here, and Suresh is definitely going to introduce you to a lot of resources that are much more localized as well. So how do we create IPM for a crop that hasn't been grown in 80 years? That's the point at which we are with this crop right now, because we know those mythologies about it being susceptible to nothing are not true. So we know we're going to have to develop integrated pest management, and part of that is disease management. And, you know, part of that is that we're not just growing one crop. We're growing one plant, but in different ways. We're really growing 3 different crops here. So we're growing in an agronomic system with fiber and grain. And then we're mostly growing in a horticultural system with our essential oil type hemp. So these are very different systems, and we manage diseases differently in each of them because of the relative value of these crops and what the susceptible times and plant parts are. So really, these 3 classes are more reasonably placed into like an agronomic system. Fiber is more like growing cotton or flax. Grain is more like growing grain corn or soybeans. And CBD systems are more like growing tomatoes or tobacco. And so we think about these systems separately when we think about how to design a disease management system for them. But just to the basics, what are we even dealing with here? What causes plant disease in the first place? And for most of us as humans, the things that cause us disease, bacteria, viruses, fungi, they're pretty similar to what cause disease in plants. However, in plants, the majority of disease is caused by fungi and things that we call water molds. So like Pythiums and Phytophthora. Those are water molds. They're not quite fungi, but we treat them a lot the same. Bacteria are a secondary kind of pathogen to fungi. So fungi cause about 80% of plant diseases, then bacteria, and then viruses. And we're definitely seeing some viruses coming in through the hemp genomics right now. Nematodes can also cause us disease, and they're these little roundworms. We haven't seen a whole lot of issues with that yet, but we should be on the lookout. And parasitic plants can actually cause disease too. We haven't seen any of these in hemp yet, but any of you who may be blueberry growers might be familiar with a plant called dodder, and that is a parasitic plant that can really become an issue in almost any crop. But then we also have these non-infectious disorders, right? Things that are not caused by germs, things that are caused by things like pollution, ozone, nutrient imbalances, temperatures that are too hot or too cold, the wrong pH, levels of light that are too high or too low. And we also want to consider those as we're developing a system for plant health, because it doesn't necessarily matter what's causing it. We want to keep our plants healthy. So in integrated pest management and integrated disease management, our main goals, right, are to eliminate or reduce the initial inoculum. Initial inoculum is the little things that get introduced to your plant that cause the disease in the first place, the disease starters, that virus particle that you inhale that all of a sudden, builds up and causes disease in your system. We've got the same thing going on with plants. So we want to reduce that, right? Just not have as much of it in our system in the first place. And then if we do have it, or we get it, we want to reduce the effectiveness of that inoculum, that germ. We want to make it not as good at causing disease in our crop. We also want to increase the resistance of the host. So how good is that host at defeating that virus or that fungus, that bacterium? It's also a goal to delay the onset of the disease, because we don't grow hemp year round unless we're growing in a greenhouse. The later on in the season we can delay disease to, that means the less overall disease we'll probably get. It won't have as much time to build up a lot of disease. And finally, slow the secondary cycles. So if you have ever seen a leaf spot on a plant, usually in the center of that spot, there are little tiny fungal particles, and that's where the fungus is making more of itself. And those spores blow off or get splashed off onto another leaf, maybe the neighboring plant, and that causes another disease cycle. So these are ongoing cycles of disease. And if we can slow or stop those, that really helps us reduce the amount of overall disease our crop can get. So those are our goals in general. Those are a lot of lofty goals, but it also shows us where we can have opportunities to control or manage disease in our system. So where do you even start when you have this new plant that hasn't been grown for 80 years legally, and really 3 new cropping systems? We kind of look to what we've done in the past. IPM is really a matter of this cycle of getting knowledge, which we're doing here today, yay, but that's ongoing. We're always trying to get more. Using that knowledge to implement prevention, let's say strategies, monitoring to find out, do we have disease at all? If we do, is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Intervening with something if we find that we did not prevent disease, and through monitoring, we now know we have disease that is spreading. Intervening with maybe a pesticide or some kind of cultural control. Assessing how that did. And that feeds directly into your knowledge for next year and into our knowledge in this industry as a whole. So did this work? Did it not? Did it work, but maybe we didn't do it soon enough? All of that feeds our knowledge in the future. So that is what we're trying to do. And you can really break it down into these steps that kind of guide us along this path. So the knowledge we need is, well, what are the common pests? How do we identify them? How do we know what we've got so we know how we can defeat it? Do we have any action thresholds? So an action threshold is when, oh, you've got 50% of this leaf area covered with this disease. That's when you know you have to do something about it, or you won't have a crop to sell at the end. For some diseases, we have that. For some diseases, we don't have those developed yet, or they don't make sense to develop for them. And what are the best control techniques? So we're learning a lot of that as we go, but I'll share some of those with you as we talk about the different diseases too. Prevention, it's not all pesticides or fungicides. We can also use resistant varieties of these crops. And we are trying to develop that information now about what is more resistant to any given disease than another variety. And really they're cultivars now, not quite varieties. What cultural controls can we use to limit the amount of impact? We'll talk about some of those as well. Monitoring is getting out there and scouting. And one thing I've noticed hemp growers are really good at doing is getting out in their crop and scouting. I'm so proud of hemp growers for this, because some of our traditional farmers who are growing traditional crops could remember better to do that. Intervention, taking the most effective and efficient action once you do reach any sort of action threshold or what you decide is your risk level. And the assessment is basically, did this action work? Giving yourself that feedback. And that's how you develop an IPM system on your own farm, because that's what we're all trying to do. We can tell you in general what measures to take and things like that, but only you are going to know what worked well on your farm, because every farm is different. Everyone's making different choices. So let's talk about some of the knowledge we need here in this newish industry where most of us are rather new to growing this crop, or at least in this system. So the knowledge we're looking for here, and some of this you'll be able to gather through, online sources, neighbor growers, your own extension service. But a lot of it is a lot of homework right now for all of us, because all of us are learning as we go. What are the growing conditions that are best for the plant in the first place? Every plant, and for that matter, every organism, has a range of environmental conditions that it likes the best. Humans don't grow so well at -20 degrees. Neither do plants. And honestly, neither does fungus. But there are certain windows of optimal growing conditions that, if we know them, we can set up our plant very well to take advantage of those and hopefully make for the best, healthiest plant that can fight disease off if it does try to take hold. At the same time, we know some of the optimal growing conditions for fungi that tend to cause disease. And if we can favor the plant and not the fungus with our growing conditions that we're giving our system, that's great to be able to do. That sets you up for a good, healthy crop. The other thing is, what diseases are a problem in the crop? And we'll talk about a lot of those here today, but knowing that ahead of time gets you ready to see those when they appear in your field and to have an idea of where to look to find out what to do about them. And time is of the essence with a lot of disease management here. How bad can these diseases be for your crop? Some diseases might look ugly, but might not really be an economic impact on your crop. And that's important to know too. If you can withstand some aesthetic damage, it might not be worth it to do any interventions. That's especially true of things that are, relatively lower value, like fiber and grain crops versus a CBD crop that you might be trying to sell based on quality and based on appearance and other factors like that. What controls and interventions are available to prevent or manage your disease? So first, knowing the diseases you're probably going to be facing, then you can arm yourself with the knowledge of, well, what can I even do about it? And find out, how effective or expensive are those? Right now, that's where we're at in the industry in trying to learn more about. So we don't have a lot of answers here yet, but a lot of that work is going on right now. And finally, how much is your crop worth? If you're not going to be able to sell your crop for very much, you know that you can't afford to spend a lot on pest or disease control. So all of these things are really integral in developing an IPM program. In general, for every crop, we're talking about doing the same or similar things in order to do really good at managing pests. So starting clean, starting with material that is resistant to the diseases that you're thinking you're going to be facing is the best place to start. Investing in those genetics, you're investing in them anyway. You might as well invest in something that's going to be resistant and that's already clean. So right now we're talking about, buying certified seed, using reputable suppliers, things like that. We're learning a lot more currently about their relative resistance to different diseases. We don't have a lot of information about that yet. Maximizing your optimal growing conditions for the plant, like I mentioned on the last slide. Knowing your common pest problems, and you're doing that right now. Keeping good records, though, is part of this. So this is the first part, but then seeing what happens in your field in the season and keeping records on that is going to help you a great deal in the future. Paying attention to your crop. I already mentioned hemp growers are great at this, but that is scouting every week in hemp, and monitoring weather. Fungus loves moisture, right? And anyone who's had a basement or a poorly ventilated bathroom knows this. Same deal in plants. When we have those warm, humid conditions, that's when we face the most challenges with disease. So, if you do get the pest or disease, knowing your enemy, your options, and how effective they are, that's what's going to drive your growing decisions. So I mentioned starting clean. Opt for certified seed whenever you can get it. And there are a lot more options this year than there have been in years past, because it takes a year to get seed certified. So, folks who didn't have that availability last year may have that availability this year. If you're doing transplants, do everything you can to select only disease-free ones, because that plant's going to be out there a long time, and you're going to be pouring nutrients and love and care into it. You want to just put your eggs in the basket that's already going to have a better shot. Picking disease-resistant cultivars when available. Like I said, we don't have this information quite yet, but that will be being developed by plant pathologists across the country, and a lot of genetics companies have in-house pathologists or breeders who are working towards this, and they're actually very good resources. Choose a field without a history of hemp diseases. So if you've been growing previously, then you want to start in a field that has not seen a lot of these challenges previously. And whatever you do, don't plant hemp back to back. We've got to rotate, just like in any other crop. A lot of times, folks who are new to growing hemp might be new to farming. And so not all of this may be as obvious to them as it is to people who have been growing other crops. But when people would call me up and say, I'm going to be a hemp grower, where do I start? One of the places you start is figuring out what else you're going to be growing, because you can't be a hemp farmer. You have to be a farmer who grows hemp, but also grows something else, because otherwise it just doesn't work without that rotation. It's not great to, like I said, put all your eggs in that basket. I mentioned maximizing your optimal growing conditions for the plant, not for the pathogen. Part of that for hemp, especially if you've grown before, is choosing a well-drained field. You'll know this if you've ever tried to plant into a field that is not well-drained, or parts of your field are not well-drained. They do not like wet feet. They also like temperatures that are rather warm. So especially for your CBD type hemp, you know, a little bit warmer, 55 to 60 degrees, you know, consistent soil temperature. For your fiber and grain, you can go down to 50 and get an earlier start on planting. But basically waiting for optimal soil moisture to seed or transplant. We've found this is pretty key. Hemp is fairly robust once you get it up to about a foot in height. But before that, it's a really wimpy plant and has a really hard time with establishment. And part of that is that it just can't punch through the soil like other crops can, like say a soybean can. And so making sure you have some soil moisture in there, but also timing so that you don't get like a pounding rain right after you plant. And then, you know, after that pounding rain happens, the soil dries up, maybe crusts over. That's where we see our worst issues, at least here in the Northeast and down into, you know, the southern parts of the country. And for the most part, if we're talking about CBD type plants, don't crowd the plants. This is not the case with fiber or grain. We do actually want to crowd them there. But for CBD, like I said, fungus loves moisture. And the closer we get those plants, the less airflow there is, the greater humidity levels there are. And that really creates a great environment for most of the pathogens that can infect. So making sure to give those plants plenty of space. That's usually easier at the beginning of the season than at the end. Paying attention. So this is the scouting part, right? Read your field or your greenhouse and find out what the plants are telling you. So for scouting, I recommend at least once a week and not at 60 miles per hour from the dashboard of your truck. That's what we tell, you know, agronomic growers, but, you know, we really do have to get out there, not just at the edge of the field, on the interiors, and scout all over the place. And monitor those weather conditions. So not only monitoring your crop, but remember to check the weather and see what it's going to be doing for the next couple of weeks. Because there are things that fungi like, you know, like moisture. There are things that hemp hates, like wet feet. And you combine those things in, you know, a couple of weeks in the summer, you know, where we don't get any sunshine and it's just rainy all the time, and you can have a real situation. Hemp can actually tolerate a lot of dryness, especially during those vegetative stages. But when we get to the part where it's putting on flowers and maybe setting seed, that's not when we want to have a lot of droughty conditions. That can be more damaging. And know your foes. So becoming familiar with the common diseases you're likely to face can save you a lot of time down the road. And this is easier said than done, right? Everyone's really busy. Sometimes we just don't get there to that piece of knowledge until we're facing that issue in the field. But just knowing where you can go to find more resources and information is really good when you do face that problem. So when you do, you know, write down what you found, write down where it was bad, where it was better, what cultivars were more susceptible, and get a positive diagnosis. We have the resources. I'll show you, you know, how to do that. But don't guess, because guessing can sometimes lead you to take one measure against this disease versus another, and it could be wrong and you're wasting your money and not getting any efficacy. There are a few resources that I'll share with you here. So this is Virginia Tech put together a resource called Integrated Pest Management of Hemp in Virginia, but it's in general useful for hemp crops all over the country because, you know, they put it all in one place. Keep in mind that this is Virginia, so things might be a little bit different. There might be things that are labeled in Virginia that are not labeled in Connecticut. but I'll share that resource with you as a link in the chat as well, so that you can download that and just have it on hand for you to flip through when you need to, if you ever have that issue. So I'm going to point out some of the diseases that we've been seeing, some of the issues that we've seen here in the Northeast mostly. And the reason it's important to look for Northeast or Mid-Atlantic resources is because a lot of the resources come out of Colorado, Oregon, Washington, and the diseases they face out there are not the same as we deal with out here. Some of them are, but it's very dry. They can control their moisture levels to a huge extent. You know, growing in Colorado and California is so easy compared to growing in the Northeast in the Mid-Atlantic, because we have all the weather and we cannot control our humidity like they can. So that's part of the reason I think we have heard such wonderful things about this crop, is because they didn't face a lot of these diseases out there where a lot of this initial work was done. But let's go through the season and talk about what things seem to be common during any given time and what to look for. So the first thing is, if we're dealing with an agronomic system like fiber or grain hemp, we're usually planting directly into the soil. And we don't have a lot of weed control options. So a lot of folks are doing tillage for weed control. So tilling right before you're planting and then planting into that with a planter or a drill. And that has led to a lot of germination and emergence issues, because when we're planting into a tilled system, it's really susceptible to that crusting. And that crust is just something that these little guys can't penetrate through. And so that's our initial problem. And then this can also lead to some issues with seedling rots. And I'll show you some of those pathogens as well. So the longer they sit under there without being able to break the surface, the more likely they are to be preyed upon by a fungus, essentially. But when we're talking about transplanting in like a CBD or a horticultural system, we've got different issues here, but it's still a really tentative, sensitive time for the plant. So moving from the greenhouse to field soil is really challenging, and it can go through transplant shock as just having gone from one system to another. But we're also seeing a lot of issues with girdling. So this is root wrapping here, and this is basically where this plant was held in a small cell for too long before getting transplanted. And this was actually in 2019. That was a year where we were ready to put our transplants out into the ground, and then we had like 2 weeks of rain. So we had to hold these for much longer than we wanted to. And hemp transplants, especially ones that are clones that are vegetatively propagated, tend to do this wrapping. And that makes it really hard for them to establish out in the field. Sometimes they won't die in the field. They'll just sit there and do nothing. They won't grow. They won't change very much. And then you pull it up and you see something like this and you're like, oh, that's why. So some of that is roughing up the hole that you stick that plant into and making sure you're getting really good soil to root contact. But part of it is just planting at a timely point in that plant's development. And I mentioned that anything that is planted or transplanted and doesn't have the ideal conditions for taking off and getting established, it's going to be more susceptible to damping off and root rots. And so most of this is caused by fungi or oomycetes that like conditions that are cool and wet. And when that plant is not thriving, it's a little vulnerable in this state. So we see these more in the early season, like just after planting or early in that seedling's life. And we can see just plants not coming up out of the ground or seedlings dying off once they have come up. In the late season, these same pathogens can show up as yellowing or just a failure to thrive, wilting. And that's because they got established in the plant at this early stage, but the plant was so small that it had enough roots to keep it going to a certain point. But once we get into August, where it's hot and dry and it's got all this biomass to support, that's when it's kind of like, I can't do it. I don't have enough roots. And that's when we start seeing those wilting or yellowing symptoms. So it's really useful to get a diagnosis on this if you can from a professional, because that can tell you if it's a fungus or an oomycete. And the control measures for those, if we do get fungicides approved, are quite different. So that is important to find out just for your records so that you know what the options are going forward. Not that we would be able to do something in that season. To avoid this, usually it's best to wait until conditions are better for planting. And I say better, meaning not persistently cold and wet, or not, mudding in a crop, like we say, waiting until you've got a drier, more better tilth to your soil. No-till production can probably help with field moisture issues, but we haven't really done this work yet. Some people have been successful with no-till production using cover crops to suppress weeds. And we haven't really tested this side by side yet, but I suspect based on other crops that it could help us here. And don't follow another crop where root rots were an issue. And this might not just be limited to hemp, but other crops like beans or vegetables, things like pumpkins where you had root rots. We do see the same fungi sometimes causing issues for multiple crops. And so if you've got a field that's a little iffy, maybe don't go there with your high value hemp. Moving into the vegetative stages, the things that we tend to see include these fungal leaf spots. So anyone who's been growing CBD type hemp may have come across these. There's a bunch of fungi. I don't want to say oomycetes yet, but we suspect there are some that are going to be causing us issues here. But mostly fungal species right now. We're not entirely sure of what the yield or quality impact are going to be. So it could look really bad on the plant, but if you are maybe selling just the biomass or you're selling just the cola for smokable flour or something like that, and you don't have any aesthetic issues on that part of the plant, maybe you're fine. Maybe it doesn't affect you. We don't yet know if these are going to affect levels of CBDs or terpenes or anything like that. So I know that some work is going on to find out about that right now. In general, the horticultural type of systems, those CBD type CBGs seem more affected by these leaf spots. And even when we do see them in fiber and grain type hemp, again, it's not as much of an issue because of our end use. It just, it doesn't matter that much. It might impact yield on grain, but we don't know yet. So we might end up finding some cultivars that have resistance against these leaf spots. And again, these are being caused by multiple different fungal varieties. So not necessarily the one in North Carolina is the one that you're going to be seeing in Connecticut all the time. But in general, these are good recommendations for all of them. For me, I look for cultivars that have been bred in more humid regions. And that's hard to find. Some of that information is difficult to learn from the companies that are breeding, especially since most of them have been breeding out in the West. But ask whoever you're getting seed from, ask them, do you have varieties that have been shown to do well on the East Coast? And that can at least help them start thinking about it and your needs rather than the needs of just people in Colorado. And stay on top of weed control. This is important for all of the diseases that we see on the top parts of hemp, because weeds can harbor, they can harbor some of these pathogens, but they also drive up your humidity levels in the crop canopy. And that makes it a more hospitable place for fungus. So you don't want that. So that weeds and potentially cover crops. If you're cover cropping between rows, that is a consideration if you're slowing down airflow. White mold is one that we've seen on CBD type and grain and fiber type hemp. White mold is caused by a fungus that can cause disease in lots and lots of crops. I point out here, it's got a huge host range. Pretty much everything that is not a grass is susceptible to this disease. So if you are planting after soybeans or alfalfa or sunflowers, and you had a white mold issue in that crop, that white mold will probably be an issue for your next crop as well. It starts out as this white fluffy growth on the stems, and then these little nubbins here, they develop into these hard black sclerotia. And those sclerotia are basically just fungus nuggets, but it's those fungus nuggets that fall to the ground and then become your inoculum for the next year. And then a year after that, and the year after that. And basically white mold is the herpes of the plant world, because once you get it, you've got it, and you can share it with friends, and it kind of doesn't go away for 7 to 10 years. So it can be a potential issue for both agronomic and horticultural systems. So what do we do about it? Well, planting in a field following corn or other grass crops, pasture, things like that can be beneficial here because they are not susceptible. Maintaining good airflow in the plant canopy, just like for other fungal diseases, really helps here because it's very much favored by high humidity. And if you find it in your field, just tear out that plant. You do not want that inoculum spreading around your field. Take that as a loss. We call it roguing out. Just pull it as soon as you can and bury it or burn it, away from things that you care about. At this point, spores don't start blowing around or anything, but once those fungus nuggets form, that's what will be your inoculum for the next year. So you don't want that to happen. Okay, moving on to flowering or seed set, depending on what kind of hemp you're growing. Botrytis is one of our big ones. And, it's something that we deal with in lots of different crops in the greenhouse, bedding plants, fruits and vegetables, especially. But, when it's cool and humid, right around the time that we have flowers on a plant, that's when it's going to be most susceptible to botrytis. So this disease is going to be most concerning for, your grain and CBD growers, because for strict fiber, we're usually cutting it before it sets seed. So we don't care so much about the flower. We want to get that cut. It can really mess up your flower production, and that's just not great for CBD production. And it's also really bad for setting seed and getting grain out of there. So while we don't have any toxins that are associated with this fungus, your flower bud quality will suffer from it. Again, this is a fungal disease. The inoculum is basically always floating around in our system. Like I said, it gets on lots of different things. It survives happily without a host. So you're really going to have to watch your crop when you've got cool, persistently wet or humid conditions. And it will get in through the flowers, basically. Those flowers, as they're starting to senesce and break down, and they've done their job, that's when they're really susceptible. So to avoid this, it's a little bit challenging, but getting your flowers harvested as soon as possible, if you are harvesting the flower, is going to be huge. We see that especially for CBD type crops, that the longer we leave them in the field, the more susceptible they are. The quality decreases over time. So, getting them out as early as you can without losing too much in terms of yield is really the best, especially if you see there's like a 2-week period coming up where it's going to be cool and wet. And in general, maintaining good airflow in and around your plants is going to be helpful. Another disease that we might see associated with the head of the plant, so either the flowers or the seeds, is Fusarium head blight. And this is a disease that we deal with in both wheat, barley, but then also some other crops like corn. So the fungus is around. We don't have any problem with not having enough of this fungus. We haven't seen it yet here in PA, but they have reported it in New York. So my colleagues in New York have seen it there. They've also seen it in North Carolina. So I suspect we are also at risk here in Pennsylvania and for you in Connecticut. So it looks like this. I did not have a better picture. I'm sorry, because I have not seen it in the field yet, but it can make your flower heads really reduced in quality. You get this white fluffy growth that could be kind of pinkish or orangish. And the really nasty thing about this one is that there's the potential for this fungus to produce a toxin. And that's what happens to us when we're dealing with it in wheat and barley. And it produces something called vomitoxin, which you don't want in anything you're eating. But there are also legal limits to that amount of toxin. As far as I know, this is not being tested for in hemp. The only mycotoxins that I see being tested for are aflatoxins. And that's probably directly related to the fact that out in Colorado and other places out west where this industry started, the only issue was aflatoxin because it was so dry. That's a toxin produced by a fungus that likes dry conditions and hot conditions. But they just haven't started looking for this out here yet. So keep this on your radar in case that does become reality for us as well. This is the fungus that causes it. It's this actually beautiful pink or red and sometimes purple fungus. If you grow it out on a plate, and this is actually on the stalk. So it's the same fungus, but instead of being on the head, it's on the stalk and can cause some stalk rots as well. So again, we've only seen this a little bit on the stalk. I have not seen it yet on the head, but keep your eyes out. And post-harvest. So for CBD type hemp, getting that crop out of your field and out of any bin you're harvesting into is super important, right? Because this crop will develop mold like no one's business. I keep hearing in like building and industrial applications that we're trying to develop hemp for is that hemp is antimicrobial, nothing grows on hemp. And I just don't know where that's coming from, because every time I've harvested hemp and let it sit for like 5 minutes, it started to heat, moisture, and fungus grows in that so easily. So immediate drying is key. And if you can't dry it immediately, get it chilled down as soon as you can, because the cooler things are, the slower they progress. Any metabolic function of pretty much any animal is slowed at lower temperatures. So that is also true for fungus and bacteria and degradation in general. So this is really key. And if you've worked with this crop before, you probably already know this. Some people are using systems that are pretty advanced. Some people are using systems that are really simple to do this. So this is actually a desiccation system. It kind of freeze dries it without freezing. It's kind of a cool drying system. And this has actually been repurposed from making spices. So companies like McCormick's and people like that use a system like this to dry the spices before processing further. And that's what this company in Pennsylvania is using. So they're putting them, the flowers on these racks, running them through this system in batches, and then they put them in totes and keep them in cold storage until they can be shipped for extraction. But a lot of people I've seen have been using tobacco barns, hanging things up on nets, things like that. You know, low frills. If it works, that's great. Just keep monitoring. For the grain, you know, the first time I harvested grain, I didn't have anything in the way of drying. And so I put it into these sacks, and this is what I pulled out after one night. This clump of fungus and some grain. So grain is really also a risk, really, because if you don't clean it and dry it immediately, or at least dry it immediately, you can get molding and heating within hours. So it's really important that you have an option for this on your farm or immediately can get to one. We're usually looking at harvesting this crop at about 15% moisture, but we've got to get it down to 9% moisture to keep it in a state with, the ability to not grow all this fungus. And that's really hard because when we harvest grain hemp, it's got all these little green grains in it as well, because hemp does not mature all at the same time. You'll have green ones along with mature ones. You can't help that. So that's why you run this risk here. And we have seen heating. We've actually had a barn burned down here in Pennsylvania that was storing hemp. We don't have all the details on it, but it's just important to keep this in mind. For grain, not drying below 5% moisture is important because the hull, that hard outer shell, will split open, and that allows microbes in, which will further heat that grain. So you can't go below a certain percentage either. For fiber hemp, these bales that you would be baling after retting, keeping them covered is really important. That and monitoring the moisture. So making sure you're baling at a low relative humidity, low moisture levels, and monitoring that for mold growth is going to be important because, again, we get heating, you can be rejected. And if you're doing or considering growing fiber, consider your distance to your processing facility and the capacity of that processing facility to take on all your biomass, because otherwise you're going to have to store these under cover. If you've got a barn, great, or you'll have to wrap them. You got to keep them out of moisture until you get them where you want them to be. So applying all this, all this knowledge is what we've got to do now in this new crop. And so part of that is knowing your enemies, right? We just talked about a bunch of them, but I haven't talked about everything you're going to face. I haven't talked about the things I don't know about yet, but you have options to help you find that. Whoops. So UConn actually offers plant disease diagnosis at its plant diagnostic laboratory. And so they do charge per sample. So it's $20 per sample, but it is so worth it to find out what you're dealing with, especially for your future knowledge, because it can be really important for managing that disease going forward. So I'll have resources at the end for you where you can find this, and we can talk if you're interested about how you would submit a sample. But also know your management options, right? Right now, we don't have a whole lot of pesticides available to us. We have some, but the majority right now are cultural controls. So picking the right plant, putting it in the right place, and doing the right maintenance is what we have to depend on here to keep a healthy crop. So these guys are actually planting into some hairy vetch, and I think it's a mix. And we've got a little hemp plant there. That's how they're doing their weed management. But that also impacts disease management. So learning about those options and how they impact your growing system is going to be important. This is another resource that my colleague Nicole Gautier put together. She's at Kentucky, and she's a really great pathologist who's been working in horticultural systems for a long time. But I'll share this with you at the end as well. It's really a cultural calendar for managing hemp disease, and it gives you ideas about what you should be doing at planting, what you should be doing in the middle of the season, things like that. So I'll share that with you as well. Like I said, there are few pesticides, but they do exist, and more are coming up all the time that are being approved by EPA. So we started out, like maybe 18 months ago with only 10 products. Now we're up to 58. So more are being added all the time. But mostly these are things that are OMRI listed. So most of them are all of them but one, I think, are OMRI listed. In general, there's some of the softer chemistries. So nothing that's a traditional fungicide or herbicide or insecticide, but things that have been used in other crops mostly for these purposes. So we're looking at a lot of neem oil products, a lot of fungi that eat insects like grubs or caterpillars, other biologicals that might stimulate the plant to induce its own defenses. The only herbicide options right now are basically vinegar or an acid that is works similarly. So we don't have anything that can be used like in season on top of that crop. Definitely check that this list, any of the products you see on that are also approved in Connecticut before trying to use it. There are processors and buyers who do testing for residue. So also check with whoever you're buying or whoever you're selling to see what their personal restrictions might be. And importantly, this list is available and I'll share that with you, but we don't have a lot of information on efficacy. We have very, very little information about this stuff regarding how well it controls a disease. We know because it's on this list that it's safe, but we don't necessarily know that it's effective. Okay, we don't get to know that just by the EPA list. So here's a list of, there's a few things on here that can help us with diseases. There's things like copper sulfate, some of these hydrogen peroxide type products that are used for sanitation, but then also can go on the plant itself. Some potassium-based stuff, like I said, neem oil. There's this giant knotweed extract that's been used in other crops. All of these basically are being used in other crops to a certain extent. So we know about them from there and how they work in those systems. But right now, we need to do a lot of work to see how they might work in a hemp system and to see if they might cause any damage in a hemp system. So we're getting there as an industry, but a lot of what we know right now is based on historical knowledge, underground knowledge, international knowledge from places that never had to stop growing hemp. So Europe, China, Canada, who's been doing it longer than we have. And a lot of it right now is going on through collaboration and sharing. So growers telling each other what works for them. Researchers like us, we can't do it all at once, but we're starting this process. And other ag industry professionals, honestly, can be very helpful here, especially that have been in the hemp space for a while. So for instance, here's what's coming out of some of the extension research programs across the country. So this is a trial that my colleague Zach Hansen did in Tennessee this year. And he works on hemp, and he's also a plant pathologist, and wanted to do an efficacy trial for some of these products on hemp leaf spot and powdery mildew. I didn't mention powdery mildew before, but it looks like powdery mildew, and you've probably seen it on other crops if you haven't on hemp. We've had a little bit of it in Pennsylvania. They've definitely had it in New York. So he wanted to find out, take a handful of these products and see how they worked against these two diseases. He looked at Regalia, Stargus, Exile, and Death Guard. And these are quite different active ingredients. One is that giant knotweed extract. Two of them are a bacillus species, so a species of bacteria that are antagonistic against other bacteria and fungi. And one is one of these potassium-based products. And here is what he found. So looking at the leaf spot, separate from the powdery mildew, because they're caused by two different fungi. So the leaf spot was controlled quite well. Moderately for the leaf spot. It was controlled by Exile, Regalia, and Stargus. but it was not controlled by this product called DefGuard. On the other hand, for powdery mildew, DefGuard did a moderate job at controlling the powdery mildew, but Exile and Regalia did excellently. On the other hand, Stargus did nothing pretty much for it. So it looks like we are having different levels of efficacy among these products depending on what we're trying to control. So they're both fungi, but these products work differently on the two different fungi. So that's another reason it's important to find out what disease you've got. Looking at how much these programs cost, and I should mention that he sprayed each of these 7 times, 10 days apart in a CBD crop, and he relied on natural inoculum. So whatever came into the field in terms of fungus came into the field, and then he rated it. So looking at how much these programs cost to apply, it kind of helps us narrow it down. So we know that we got good control of both the leaf spot and the powdery mildew with Exile and Regalia. They helped us here. And we also got pretty good control from Stargus just of the leaf spot. So what we know about this then is that, okay, to control with an Exile program or with a Regalia program, it's going to cost us about $800 a season per acre. And Regalia is very similar, just a little bit less. Whereas Stargus is, down around $500 a season, but it only gives us control of the leaf spot. So depending on what you're facing out there, it might inform your choice. Well, if I only have leaf spot to deal with, I can choose the cheaper option. But if I think I'm going to have issues with both, maybe I need to invest in something a little more expensive, but that will give me better control. So maybe Exile or Regalia would be the choice for me. On the other hand, it's nice to know that the most expensive option did not help us very much on either of these. So that's great information. I love it when we get economic data along with the efficacy data. Look for that whenever you can. And like I said, we've got a long way to go. We don't have all the answers yet, but they are coming. They're coming from my colleagues and the work we're doing and the work that everyone is doing in this industry, including and especially the growers. So I'm going to share some resources with you in the chat and make sure you have the links that I mentioned. And I'll show you where you can find our website. And I'm also on Twitter, and this is my information. But as we do that, as I put those things in the chat, please feel free to ask me any questions you might have or share with us your experiences as well, because I need to know this stuff so we can figure out what you need us to work on as an industry. And I am working together with other researchers across the country to find out what your needs are, what everyone's facing in all of the various regions they're in. And so if we have more information from you guys, that helps us do a better job at all of that. So please do tell us. So do we have any questions yet?
We do have a couple of questions out there. And I have to admit, I was writing fast and furious too. Love this information. Thank you so much. I'm a huge fan of the whole collaboration stuff. I couldn't agree with you more. When there's opportunities for this type of a basic research, to be able to share information like this, whether it's among the institutions or person to person, farm to farm, couldn't be more helpful with all this stuff. Especially like you say, there's so much to learn in here. Well, I want to throw some, Suresh had a couple of really good questions that's out there. I was just going to mention very quickly my personal interest in what you had said about some of the cultural practices that are available out there. You know, maybe the most simple one is the scouting, but I have to admit a personal interest in the plant management or the field management that's out there. So I was particularly watching when you mentioned the no-till and the cover crops, and then that photograph that's on there. It seems like with the inoculum, there's so many plant diseases that are bacterial and fungi related that can be spread from the soil, and to be able to manage some of that with, we can manage the airborne stuff with the spacing, and allowing for the wind to help dry things down and manage some of the things that way. But for some of that soil splash and things that are born from the soil, it seems like the cultural practice is to be able to manage the soil could be a good place to start. So I'm particularly interested in that type of research and what things are coming with that. There's a little bit. Sorry,
we're actually trying to work through that in some of our really well-established systems like corn and soybeans still, because a lot of people are interested in no-till. They're interested in cover cropping and planting green in those crops, and it can help us with diseases sometimes, and it can actually make diseases worse sometimes. So, like for instance, in corn, we find that a rye cover crop is great. We do really well with rye, except it can harbor pythium for our corn. And so planting green into rye for corn is not the best idea. Usually killing it early, maybe 2 weeks ahead is best for corn, but that's not necessarily the case for, say, soybean. So a lot of that work is happening now, in not just in hemp, but in these other crops as well. Rodale Institute is actually doing a lot of rotational work, especially with cover cropping and seeing how well hemp does after certain rotations. So I would encourage folks to go there and find out some more information, and if that fits a system. A lot of times they use cover crops that might not work well at higher latitudes because of the season length. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But, our colleague Heather Darby in Vermont is starting to do some of this work too. And she's great on the hemp front. She's amazing and has a lot of resources. She seems to have done a little study in just about everything.
Agreed. We had her on the last webinar, and she shared with us some of that stuff. In addition, we also had a farmer from the Kentucky, Tennessee area. One of the things that farmer had mentioned was that he had done just a little bit of experimenting on his own with spacing, particularly row spacing, but also in row. He had done, I'm going to say, a standard 40-inch row, and then he had done every other row up to an 80-inch row. So he did something that was very compact, something that was a little bit more standard, and then something that was not standard with more space. What is your standard spacing on your plants?
On CBD type hemp, we have not found much difference between like 4x4 up to 6x6. Right in there, it seems like just do what works for your system and your equipment, especially if you're trying to manage weeds between the rows. Sometimes you just got to base it on what you can set up your plastic layer for and what your width is if you're going to mow it, so that you can get it done in a year. Because a lot of our growers realized, well, spacing is one thing, but my equipment is another thing, and I don't want to hire like 5 kids to go out there with a weed whacker all summer and deal with my weeds. It's just, trade-offs, always these trade-offs.
Absolutely. Cause and effect for everything, isn't there? Suresh, could I bounce over to you just very quickly? You had a couple of really good comments in here. You had mentioned that some of the Connecticut growers had experienced that root bound issue. I was wondering, Suresh, could you just comment on, did you get to witness some of that yourself, and what led up to that root bound issue?
Totally, yeah. If the transplants stay longer than 4 weeks in the greenhouse, in a small, like a 50 cell tray, that's where the root bound happens. And I saw the impact in the yield, and also some plants broke and died because those plants had a poor root system because of root bound that was started in the greenhouse. So that's interesting. You can start the root bound in the greenhouse and have impact later on in the season.
Yeah, it really seems to impact the architecture of the roots. And then, like you said, you can not get a great root system. And so it's more susceptible to breaking. And if you've got this big tree that you're trying to support with a weird little root system, it just doesn't work.
Yep.
Here's a very, I'm going to say ignorant question. Is there anything that you can do about that while you're transplanting? Are you able to cut the roots and encourage new root growth? Is there anything to do about that?
You know, I haven't tried it. Suresh, have any of your growers tried any roughing up of the roots or anything like that?
So I think trying to maybe remove and break the clots at the time of transplanting might help, because when it's root bound and the roots are well covered in that root ball, they tend to stick together as they are. But if you tend to break them somehow, maybe with use a pencil to push the transplant from underneath the tray, that somehow breaks the system, and I think that helps.
Yeah, some of our growers have also, if they see that's going to happen, they'll actually up pot to a larger size, and that can buy you some time. It's a lot of work, but you know, if the alternative is not getting a plant that's useful, some have decided it's worth it.
Well, you mentioned of a 2-week delay just due to wet conditions. I think it's probably something everyone can relate to. That is not so uncommon. But if it comes between having a root-bound plant and the potential for crop loss or replanting, it might make that an easier option. Alyssa, you'd also gotten a reaction from Suresh based on the leaf spots. So Suresh, could I follow up with you on that one? How severe did you see the leaf spot? And again, just in the 2020 growing season, it's a little bit more dry. So I guess I was surprised at your comment on that.
Yeah, so this was from 2 growers, and it's directly related to spacing. And one of the plots was closer spaced. I think was 4x4, and the other was 4x6. And the cultivar was same, everything else was same, and growers noticed this obvious difference in leaf spot intensity, and perhaps that was the reason the most affected plot tested high in THC. So the grower reached out to me because his plot tested high in THC, and he was wondering if he can do anything about that to remediate the THC, and asking about the history and cultural practices. I learned that perhaps because of closer spacing and not enough aeration, that contributed to diseases, and that might have contributed to stresses leading to higher THC. Being said that, Cornell did a research and with lots of simulated stresses and did not find a difference, meaning stress plants were not producing different levels of cannabinoids, significantly different levels of cannabinoids than non-stress plant. That was Cornell's finding, which is not in line with what some of our growers found.
I think that's a really important point that Suresh is making. We're so early in this crop and the research around this crop that we've only got 1 year of data on a lot of these studies. So that powdery mildew one I showed, that's 1 year. No one should be making their entire decision on just 1 year of data. That's just like a start. And, we usually like to get at least 3 years on any of these before we put it out, but everyone's so desperate for information now that I think we're just pushing it out as we get it. So,
Yeah.
take
There you
all of
go.
it with a grain of salt.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that one, Suresh and Alyssa? So in that Connecticut example, where it was the same hybrid and 2 different spacings, is that cause for a reason to look for how many different hybrids you should have? So I guess my question might be, is there a recommendation for how many different hybrids you might want to have in your cropping system?
As we develop information regarding susceptibility to any of these, I think that will start becoming part of the decision making. Right now, it might not be a bad idea to hedge your bets, spread your risk by selecting at least a handful of different varieties or cultivars. But at the same time, that also means that you have to deal with each of their relative maturities in terms of figuring out when you're going to be harvesting and what they'll need from you. And then also, I'm not sure what your testing procedures are in Connecticut, but in Pennsylvania, we would have to test each of those separately. So each variety has to be tested separately, and that can be a cost you may or may not want to bear. So
yeah, I believe that's same in Connecticut. You can't have 2 different cultivars in one plot. So that would be 2 different plots, and you have to test them separately.
Okay. All right. Last question here is, Suresh had asked, are there some resources available that describe the different thresholds for different diseases that you had mentioned?
Not yet. No, we're not there yet. In fact, we're still working on those for some of our standard agronomic crops for a lot of diseases. So it's probably going to be quite a while. So the procedure there is you have to figure out what the disease issues are, and we're still at that point. Then you have to figure out what is available to control them and how well those things control them. Then you have to figure out what is the cost of the crop that you're going to be, what revenue are you expecting to get from this? And that's the information that goes into figuring out what your action threshold is. And we don't have most of that information right now, especially that last one. Where are you going to get paid? That's on an individual basis to some extent, but it really does help drive that question of, is it worth it for me to take this action or not? How much am I going to lose is a big part of making that choice.
Absolutely. Yeah. A question I think a lot of growers are asking. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah. I wish I knew.
Right. So many of it. All right. Well, Alyssa, thank you very much for that. We'll wrap that up, but please know that she's here for just a few more minutes. If you do have some questions, we'll keep an eye on this. But in the meantime, I do want to make sure that we have a proper introduction for Suresh Gamire, who is a wealth of information related to this for the Connecticut area. Suresh is with the University of Connecticut Extension System as the vegetable and hemp specialist. He's been very active with the local hemp community, taking calls, phone calls, emails, and visiting fields when there's problems or questions that are coming up. So Suresh is going to give us some helpful tools to help get in touch when you have some questions related to hemp production.
Thanks, Zim, and thanks, Alyssa, for your great presentation as well. Just to reiterate that this webinar has 1.5 pesticide recertification credit available. So if you did not provide your pesticide application information while registering for this webinar, you can do that via email. I'll put my email address in the chat box. You can reach out to me, and then we can connect and get necessary information to get the pesticide credits. And we have a short 2-question quiz at the end, and I encourage you to participate on that. With that, I would like to share some of the information about Yukon hemp team and resources available to our growers. Let me share my screen. I hope you can see my screen. So Yukon, being one of the land grant institution, is doing research, education, and extension in the field, in cannabis field as well. We have a web page dedicated to hemp, which is hemp.canner.yukon.edu. I'll briefly talk about research focuses, extension, and education in this presentation today. So the focus of the research at Yukon has been to develop molecular techniques for to improve the composition and quantity of various cannabinoids and other beneficial traits. And other focus has been to develop tissue culture system for cannabis and optimize for feminized hemp seed production. And I'll share who are working on each of these sectors later. And we have undergraduate course, horticulture of cannabis from seed to harvest, and that was a very popular course. We have another course, SPSS 3995, horticulture of cannabis. And there is also opportunity for independent study, depending available upon request. So I can work with students and growers to get that independent study started, and there are a few other faculty at Yukon who can also work on this, which I'll provide the list. Briefly talking about the hemp extension program, the goal of the program, the objective of the hemp extension program is to assist commercial growers. As Alyssa mentioned, there can't be just hemp growers, because it has to be rotated with something else to be effective, sustainable, and economical. So the objective of the hemp extension program is to help growers with diagnosis and management of hemp pests, which include insect diseases, weeds, and other problems. I also collaborate with other universities and organizations in conducting hemp pest management research, extension activities in Connecticut and New England region. This is one example where I worked with UVM on a scouting project, and I created a YouTube video on how to do scouting in a hemp field. And measure insects and diseases. We'll talk about insects in our next month's presentation. Is Scott Lewins from UVM. We'll talk about insects in detail, but just a very quickly, these were some of the major insects and diseases that were noticed in 2019 and 2020 season in Connecticut. European corn borer, corn earworm were two major insects, and Septoria leafy spot and bipolaris leafy spots were two major diseases that we observed, and there are potential for other diseases to be problematic in future, like gray mold and white mold, and Alyssa explained those. The program that we do emphasize on healthy soil, balanced plant nutrition, proper pest and beneficial identification, scouting and monitoring techniques. I just want to emphasize that the scouting and monitoring is one of the most critical thing you can do to minimize huge loss before it's too late, and preventative management strategies like cultural practices, spacing, starting with healthy seedlings or seeds. And as Jim mentioned in the beginning, there are educational outreach opportunities for growers. I do consultations with commercial hemp growers. I take phone calls, emails, and do farm visits on need basis. So please feel free to reach out to me. If there are any things you'd like to discuss run by me regarding hemp production and planning. I from Yukon Extension work with this team in conducting annual Connecticut Hemp Conference. I also produced seasonal pest report explaining what we saw in our hemp fields. And I also have an email list of hemp growers in Connecticut, hemp growers in Connecticut, where I send informational emails and emails about events that are happening in our region or virtually. So you can email me to be added on that email list. This is our Yukon Hemp team. Jerry Borkwitz is working on molecular techniques. Matt DeBacco teaches the horticulture courses. Myself, Suresh Gamiri, is an extension educator. Yi Lee is also working on molecular techniques, and Jessica Lubel Brand is working on feminized seed production. So if you know some students who are interested in doing independent study, those students can reach out to any of us to do independent study with on hemp. And this is my last slide with lots of information. As Alicia mentioned, no one can be just hemp growers. So these resources are helpful not necessarily for hemp industry, but also in general. For example, new farmers bucket list. This is very very nicely put together list of information resources for new farmers. How to start a farm. What are the resources available for a new farmer? I highly encourage for any new farmer to go to this website. And hemp is grown indoor and outdoor. We have greenhouse resources on this link. Alicia also mentioned the plant diagnostic lab at UConn, where you can submit plant samples, hemp samples, as well as other your rotational crop samples. And we have UConn Soil Lab to do the soil testing for hemp and other crops. Connecticut Agriculture Experiment Station is also available for our growers for soil testing, as well as disease and insect diagnostics. There are a lot of resources available in Connecticut Department of Agriculture website as well. And I provide a few other resources. This one, NEWA, is Network for Environmental and Weather Applications. So in order to predict the forecast and time your planting, harvesting, etc., this could be really helpful. And this link right here is for sign up. We have multiple email list for vegetables, for fruit, for greenhouse crop, and so many other things. You can choose to be on one or more of those email lists by going to this link. I also mention here Yukon IPM website, Yukon Extension website, and last but not least, this is pesticide use guidance from DEEP, where it provides guidance for growers on using pesticides, and it lists all the pesticides that are registered to be used in hemp in Connecticut. With that, that's all I have. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Suresh. Really appreciate that. We are at the end of our time for today. We're just a little bit over. I'm keeping an eye on the questions and answers and the chat. At the moment, we don't have anything, but I think there's a little bit of debate on this, but I think I'd like to ask if we could please put the poll up, and that poll with the two questions is for the Connecticut DEEP pesticide certification. So if you can answer these two questions, stating that you've watched this webinar today, and send the answers and the information to Suresh Gimire, the information that he's providing in the chat box at UConn.edu, then you are eligible for those recertification credits. So with that, I'll begin the wrap up for today. All registrants are going to receive a brief survey about today's webinar series. If you would please take the time to fill in your thoughts and comments on the survey, it would help us a lot. Your feedback is very important to us. And thank you all for attending today's webinar. We'd like to especially thank our planning partners and our planning committee, Amanda Fargo-Johnson with Connecticut RC&D, Suresh Gimire and Matt Tabacco from UConn Extension, Becky Ghosh, John Ireland, Kate Nelson, and myself, Jim Hyde, and a special thanks to Jeff Wenzel for hosting today's program. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for viewing shortly on the Connecticut RC&D/hemp website, also available on YouTube. And we invite you all to check out the Connecticut RC&D website to register for the upcoming, the two remaining webinar series. The next one in 2 weeks, Wednesday, April 21st, is going to discuss processing hemp, lessons learned from the field, and looking towards the future, hosted by Connecticut's own John Ireland. And with that, we will thank you again for attending today's webinar and wish you all a good day. Thank you.